What if I told you that the deadliest disaster in human history actually created some of the wealthiest families the world has ever seen? I'm talking about a plague that wiped out half of Europe. Bodies piled in the streets, entire villages erased from existence, children burying their parents, parents burying their children, a nightmare that lasted years. And yet, certain families walked away from this horror richer than they could have ever imagined. Sounds impossible, right? Maybe even a little disturbing. But here's the truth that history books often skip over. When 50 million people die, their money doesn't die with them. Their land doesn't vanish. Their businesses don't disappear into thin air. Someone inherits it all. Someone buys it cheap. Someone steps into the gap and builds an empire. Today, we're going to follow the money. We're going to trace the path from mass graves to massive fortunes, and we're going to meet the families whose descendants still carry famous names to this day. If you love uncovering the hidden stories behind wealth and power, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Here on Monetary Archaeologist, we dig up the financial secrets that shaped our world. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's travel back to the year 1347. The ships are arriving. The rats are crawling onto the docks, and everything is about to change. Picture Europe in the early 1300s. Kings rule with iron fists. Noble families have controlled the same lands for generations. Peasants work fields they will never own. And the rich stay rich because the system is locked in place. Banking families in Italy control international finance. The Bardi family, the Peruzzi family, these are the giants. They lend money to kings. They fund wars. They are untouchable, or so everyone thinks. In the countryside, feudalism keeps everyone in their place. If your father was a serf, you will be a serf. If your grandfather worked that field, you will work that field too. Social mobility? That's not even a concept most people understand. Trade routes crisscross the continent. Merchants move silk from the east, grain from the plains, salt from the coasts. Everything flows through established networks controlled by established families. This is a world of rigid hierarchy, a world where your birth determines your destiny, a world where change happens slowly, over centuries, not years. And then, in October of 1347, 12 ships pull into the harbor at Messina, Sicily. The sailors on board are dying. Many are already dead. Those still alive have strange black swellings under their arms and on their necks. They're coughing blood. They're burning with fever. The authorities try to turn the ships away, but it's already too late. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. Within 5 years, between 1347 and 1351, somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population was dead. Let me say that again so it really sinks in. Half of Europe, gone. Imagine every other person you know just vanishing. Your neighbors, your coworkers, half your family. In some towns, the death rate was even higher, 70%, 80%. Some villages had no survivors at all. A monk in Italy wrote that the bells stopped ringing because there was nobody left to ring them. Gravediggers couldn't keep up with the bodies. People dug mass graves and threw corpses in by the hundreds. In Florence alone, over half the population died in a single year. In Paris, 800 people were dying every day at the peak. In London, 300 bodies were buried daily in special plague pits. The economy didn't just slow down, it collapsed. Farms went unplanted because the farmers were dead. Ships sat in harbors because the crews were dead. Shops closed because the merchants were dead. Entire trade networks fell apart almost overnight. Here's the economic reality that most people miss. When this many people die this quickly, it doesn't just create suffering. It creates a complete restructuring of who owns what. Think about it. A landowner dies. His son dies. His brother dies. His cousins die. Who gets the land now? A merchant dies. His business partner dies. His apprentices die. Who takes over the business? A banker dies. His heirs die. His clients can't pay their debts because they're also dead. What happens to all that wealth? It doesn't disappear, it transfers. And if you're still alive, if you're in the right place at the right time, if you have even a little bit of money or influence left, the opportunities are endless. Before we meet the winners, we need to understand how the old wealthy families fell, because their collapse created the vacuum that new fortunes would fill. The Bardi and Peruzzi banking families were the most powerful financial institutions in Europe before the plague. Based in Florence, they had branches across the continent. They lent massive sums to kings and popes. They were medieval Europe's version of too big to fail. But they did fail. Even before the plague arrived, King Edward III of England had defaulted on enormous loans. The royal bankruptcies shook these banking houses to their core. Then the plague hit. Partners died, branch managers died, clients died, people who owed money died before they could pay it back. Suddenly, the Bardi and Peruzzi weren't financial giants anymore. They were crumbling institutions struggling to survive. By the time the worst of the plague passed, these once mighty banking families were shadows of what they had been. Their dominance was over. The financial landscape of Florence was wide open, and someone was waiting to fill that gap. The same pattern repeated across Europe. In England, ancient noble families lost their heirs. Land that had been in the same family for 300 years suddenly had no legitimate owner. In France, entire branches of aristocratic lines were wiped out. In Germany, merchant families who had controlled trade for generations simply ceased to exist. The old guard wasn't just weakened. In many cases, they were completely erased from history. Now the question becomes, who was smart enough, lucky enough, or ruthless enough to take advantage? If you know anything about Renaissance Italy, you've heard the name Medici. Patrons of the arts, bankers to popes, rulers of Florence, one of the most influential families in European history. But here's what most people don't realize. The Medici weren't always powerful. Before the plague, they were a modest Florentine family. Respectable, sure, but not remarkable. Not even close to the top of the social ladder. Everything changed because of one man and perfect timing. Giovanni de' Medici founded the Medici Bank in 1397. Pay attention to that date. This is decades after the first plague outbreak, but right in the middle of recurring waves that kept destabilizing society. The second major plague wave had just swept through Florence again. Giovanni wasn't a genius inventor of new financial instruments. He wasn't a daring explorer who discovered new trade routes. His great talent was simpler than that. He was alive when his competitors weren't. The banking families that had dominated Florence for generations were weakened or destroyed. The Bardi were recovering from bankruptcy. The Peruzzi were struggling. Smaller banks had lost partners, heirs, and clients to repeated plague outbreaks. Giovanni stepped into this vacuum with intelligence and ambition. He built relationships carefully, he managed risk wisely, and he positioned himself for the opportunity of a lifetime. The Medici Bank secured the account of the papacy itself. They became the Pope's bankers. This wasn't just profitable, it was a mark of legitimacy that elevated the family above their remaining competitors. Would this have happened without the plague? Almost certainly not. The established banking families would have maintained their dominance. The Medici would have remained successful but second tier. Instead, Giovanni's son Cosimo would become the unofficial ruler of Florence. His descendants would become dukes and popes. The family would fund Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and countless other artists who defined the Renaissance. You could make a strong argument that the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel owes its existence, in part, to the Black Death. North of Florence, another family was playing an even more aggressive game. The Visconti already had power before the plague. They were rulers of Milan. But they were surrounded by rivals, limited in their expansion, contained by the balance of power among Italian city-states. The plague changed the equation completely. When noble families died without heirs, their lands had to go somewhere. Sometimes they reverted to higher-ranking nobles. Sometimes they fell into legal limbo. And sometimes, if you were aggressive and well-positioned, you could simply take them. Bernabo Visconti was aggressive.
very aggressive. As the plague swept through northern Italy in wave after wave, the Visconti absorbed territory at a pace that would have been impossible in normal times. Neighboring nobles died. Their lands were seized. Marriage alliances that would have taken generations to negotiate were concluded quickly because there were fewer options, fewer competitors, fewer obstacles. John Galeazzo Visconti, who came after Bernabo, used this accumulated power to achieve something remarkable. In 1395, he was crowned the first Duke of Milan. Not just lord, not just ruler, Duke, a title that elevated his family above other Italian nobles. Think about what that means. In the space of about 50 years,
The Visconti went from being powerful lords to being dukes whose authority was recognized across Europe. In a normal century, that kind of elevation might have taken 200 years of patient political maneuvering. In the chaos following the Black Death, it took a generation. The mechanism was simple, even if the execution was complex. When 60% of people die, 60% of competitors die too. Inheritance lines collapse, legal claims to land become murky, and whoever has the strength to grab territory and the lawyers to justify it emerges on top. Across the English Channel, something different was happening. The great noble families didn't collapse quite as dramatically as in Italy, but a whole new class was rising from below. Before the plague, English society was rigidly divided. You had the great nobles at the top, you had peasants at the bottom, and in between, there wasn't much room for anyone to climb. The Black Death changed that forever. Consider the Paston family. Before the plague, they were modest landowners in Norfolk. Not poor exactly, but certainly not powerful. They worked their small holdings and existed far below the level of politics and influence. Then their neighbors started dying. Estates became available at prices nobody had ever seen. Sometimes land could be bought for almost nothing because the sellers were desperate or dead. Sometimes properties fell into legal limbo and could be claimed by anyone bold enough to make the argument in court. The Pastons were bold, and they were smart. They bought land when they could. They pursued legal claims when buying wasn't possible. They married strategically, connecting themselves to other rising families. Over 2 or 3 generations, they transformed from minor landowners into genuine power players. We know their story in remarkable detail because they left behind the Paston Letters, one of the most famous collections of medieval correspondence. These letters show a family clawing its way up the social ladder, grabbing every opportunity that death and chaos provided. The Pastons weren't alone. The Della Pole family followed a similar path, combining trade wealth with shrewd land acquisition during the plague years. The Nevilles expanded their holdings in northern England through a combination of strategic marriages and absorbing estates left vacant by plague deaths. Even the Stanley family, who would later play a decisive role in putting the Tudor dynasty on the throne, benefited from the reshuffling of English society that the plague created. None of these families were noble before the Black Death. After it, they were powers in the land. Their descendants would shape English politics for centuries. Now let's travel to the cold waters of the Baltic Sea, because some of the smartest operators during the plague years weren't noble families at all. They were merchants. The Hanseatic League was a network of trading cities stretching from Germany to Russia to the Netherlands. They controlled shipping in northern Europe. They moved grain, timber, salt, fish, and cloth. They were the commercial backbone of the region. When the plague hit, demand for goods went crazy. Farms couldn't produce enough food because farmers were dead. Timber was needed to build coffins and replacement housing. Salt was essential for preserving what food remained. Prices for basic necessities shot through the roof. The Hanseatic merchants saw opportunity where others saw disaster. Families like the Veckinchesons in Danzig expanded their operations while competitors collapsed. They bought grain from regions less affected by plague and sold it at enormous markups in devastated cities. They secured monopolies on crucial goods and used those monopolies to build political power within their cities. The Warendorp family in Lübeck followed a similar path. So did the Gosselins. These weren't noble names. These were merchant families who understood that in times of scarcity, whoever controls supply controls everything. By the end of the 14th century, the Hanseatic League was more powerful than ever. Their ships dominated northern trade. Their merchants sat on city councils. Their influence stretched from London to Novgorod. They had turned plague-time chaos into lasting commercial empire. There's another winner from the Black Death that nobody talks about. Because unlike the Medici or the Visconti or the rising English gentry, this winner wasn't a family at all. It was the church. When people are dying in massive numbers, when the world seems to be ending, when hell feels very real and very close, people get religious, really religious, and they start giving things away. Donations to monasteries skyrocketed during the plague years. Dying nobles bequeathed their estates to abbeys in exchange for prayers for their souls. Wealthy merchants gave land to convents hoping to buy their way into heaven. Entire villages were donated to church orders. The Cistercians in France accumulated vast territories. The Benedictines in Germany expanded their holdings dramatically. Monasteries that had been modest institutions became major landowners almost overnight. And here's the crucial difference between church property and family property. When a noble family dies out, their lands might be contested, divided, or seized by rivals. But monasteries don't die. Abbots pass away, but the institution continues. Land that enters church hands tends to stay in church hands. By the end of the 14th century, the church controlled more land across Europe than ever before. These weren't just spiritual institutions, they were economic powerhouses. They collected rents, they produced goods, they employed workers, they shaped local economies. The Black Death was very good for the salvation business. Now here's something that might surprise you. Not all the winners were wealthy elites or powerful institutions. Ordinary workers won too. Before the plague, labor was cheap. There were always more peasants willing to work. Serfs had no bargaining power. If you didn't like your conditions, too bad. 10 other people were waiting to take your place. After the plague, everything flipped. Half the workforce was dead. Suddenly, labor was scarce. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had leverage. Wages went up across Europe. Workers who had earned a few pennies a day started demanding more, and getting it. Because if you were a landlord with crops rotting in the field, you would pay whatever it took to find someone to harvest them. The elite panicked. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It was illegal to pay workers more than they had earned before. It was illegal for workers to demand higher wages. It didn't work. You can't legislate away supply and demand. When workers are scarce, their value goes up. Period. The laws were widely ignored or undermined. Workers moved to wherever they could get better terms. Serfs abandoned their lords and sought opportunities elsewhere. For a brief window in European history, working people had real power. They negotiated better conditions. They escaped feudal obligations. They accumulated small savings that would have been impossible before. This wasn't wealth in the sense of the Medici or the Visconti. Nobody was building palaces or funding Renaissance art, but it was genuine improvement in the lives of ordinary people. Higher wages, better food, more freedom. The plague had done something that peasant revolts and reform movements had failed to achieve. It had given workers bargaining power through pure mathematics. When half the laborers die, the remaining half become twice as valuable. Here's where things get uncomfortable, because what I've just described isn't ancient history. It's a pattern that repeats every time disaster strikes. The Black Death didn't destroy wealth, it redistributed wealth. It took assets from people who died and transferred them to people who survived. It rewarded whoever had the resources, connections, and nerve to act while everyone else was paralyzed by fear and grief. Sound familiar? During the 2008 financial crisis, while millions of people lost their homes and jobs, distressed debt investors made fortunes. Private equity firms bought assets at pennies on the dollar.
Hedge funds that had bet against the housing market became legendary. During the COVID pandemic, while small businesses closed forever and workers lost their incomes, billionaire wealth increased by trillions of dollars. Tech companies exploded in value. Online retailers captured market share from dying competitors. The tools are different. Medieval bankers didn't use derivatives or stock options. The Visconti couldn't execute hostile takeovers through shell companies. But the fundamental dynamics are identical. Crisis creates opportunity. Scarcity creates profits. The death of competitors creates openings for survivors. And those with capital, information, and flexibility are always positioned to benefit. This isn't a moral judgment. It's just how economics works in moments of extreme disruption. The question isn't whether some people will profit from catastrophe. The question is who and how and whether we're paying attention. So what can we actually learn from the Black Death? What's the lesson buried beneath all these stories of death and fortune? First, catastrophes don't equalize wealth. They concentrate it. Every crisis in history has transferred assets from the many to the few. The mechanism changes, the result doesn't. Second, survival is itself an advantage. The Medici didn't need to be brilliant. They needed to be alive when their competitors weren't. Sometimes showing up is half the battle. Third, liquidity matters more in crisis than in normal times. Whoever has cash when everyone else needs cash will acquire assets at discounts that seem impossible in stable markets. The families who rose during the plague were often the families who could buy when others could only sell. Fourth, old systems become vulnerable when stressed.
Feudalism didn't collapse because of philosophy or politics. It collapsed because the economic foundation of cheap labor disappeared when half the peasants died. Systems that seem eternal can shatter overnight when their core assumptions stop being true. Fifth, new elites emerge from the chaos. The Medici, the Visconti, the English gentry families. These weren't the powers of 1340. They were the powers of 1450. Crisis reshuffles the deck. Stand back and look at what the Black Death actually accomplished. It set the stage for the Renaissance by empowering families like the Medici who would fund art and culture. It weakened feudalism and strengthened the position of workers and urban craftsmen. It consolidated power in families like the Visconti who would shape Italian politics for generations. It elevated English gentry families who would later contest for the crown during the Wars of the Roses. It strengthened commercial networks like the Hanseatic League that would dominate Northern European trade for centuries. It enriched the church and expanded its landholdings across the continent. The plague that seemed to end the world actually created the world that followed. Modern banking, Renaissance art, the decline of serfdom, the rise of the middle class. All of these things have roots in the demographic catastrophe of the 14th century. Out of death came transformation. Out of chaos came opportunity. Out of the worst disaster in European history came the foundations of early modern Europe. Here's the uncomfortable truth that history keeps teaching us. Disasters don't destroy wealth, they move it. They transfer it from the dying to the living, from the weak to the strong, from those who freeze to those who act. The Black Death killed 50 million people. But it also made the Medici. It made the Visconti. It made dozens of families whose names you've never heard, but whose descendants shaped politics and culture for centuries. That's the real monetary archaeology of the plague years. Beneath all that death, wealth was being redistributed on a scale that makes modern financial crises look trivial. And whoever understood that, whoever positioned themselves correctly, whoever had the nerve to act while others mourned, they emerged richer than before. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the patterns rhyme. And if you don't understand how wealth behaves in crisis, you'll never understand how power is really built. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you think about history, hit that subscribe button. Here on Monetary Archaeologist, we dig up the financial secrets buried in the past. Because history has the answers. You just have to know where to dig.